Once Black Hollow was a thriving town. Settlers arrived in the early 1800s, drawn by the fertile land and dense forest. Life was simple, but the townsfolk were a superstitious lot, clinging to old beliefs and dark folklore passed down from their ancestors. They believed in the unseen, in curses, and in vengeful spirits lurking in the shadows of the trees. For generations, the town flourished despite its remote location. But in the mid-1900s, Black Hollow began to change. It was around this time that Elias Marsh moved into the town, a man who would become the center of the town's most terrifying legend. Elias was a recluse, a farmer who preferred the company of his animals and his land to that of other people. He lived on a large, isolated piece of property at the edge of the forest, a place where the trees grew unnaturally tall and close together, their thick branches blotting out the sky. His farmhouse was old, built long before most of the town's buildings, and had a dilapidated, eerie look about it. The windows were always dark, and a strange silence seemed to hang around the place, even when the wind was howling through the woods. The townsfolk, already wary of outsiders, found Elias unsettling. He rarely came into town, and when he did, it was only to buy supplies, always paying in cash and speaking as little as possible. He was tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through you. Some claimed they saw him muttering to himself, speaking in a language no one recognized. Others swore they had seen him out in his fields late at night, under the light of a full moon, performing strange rituals with his hands raised to the sky. The rumors spread quickly, fueled by fear and suspicion. The first strange occurrence came in the spring. The crops that year began to fail, withering away despite the rain and warm sun. Farmers who had tended their fields for generations found their soil suddenly barren, and no matter how hard they worked, their crops would not grow. At the same time, livestock began disappearing. It started with chickens and pigs, but soon cows and horses were vanishing from their barns. The townsfolk were baffled and afraid, but no one knew who or what was behind it. Then one night, a young boy named Thomas went missing. He had been playing near the edge of the forest when his parents heard him scream. They ran to the spot where they had last seen him, but there was no trace of the boy. The ground was undisturbed, the trees silent, and no matter how hard they searched, they could find no sign of him. The only clue was a strange, deep footprint in the mud near the forest's edge, too large to be a man's and too small to belong to any known animal. Fear gripped the town. The more superstitious among them began to whisper about curses and dark forces at work, and soon the rumors turned to Elias Marsh. He had always been strange, they said, always kept to himself, and there was something unnatural about him. Some claimed they had seen shadows moving around his farmhouse at night, shapes that were not human. Others insisted they had heard strange, guttural noises coming from his property. The whispers grew louder, and soon the town was convinced that Elias was behind the strange events. They believed he had cursed their crops and stolen their animals, and that he had taken young Thomas for some dark ritual. The town's fear soon turned to anger. A small group of men, led by the local preacher, decided to confront Elias. They marched to his farmhouse one cold autumn night, armed with torches and guns. When they arrived, the house was dark and silent, just as it always was. They called out to him, demanding that he come out and face them, but there was no answer. The preacher, his voice shaking with rage and fear, shouted that they would burn the house down if Elias didn't show himself. Still, there was no response. The men, their fear overtaking their reason, set the farmhouse on fire. As the flames engulfed the old building, a low, inhuman scream echoed through the valley. It was not the scream of a man, but something deeper, more primal. The men froze, their hearts pounding, as the sound seemed to come from the forest itself, not the house. The fire raged on, consuming the old wood, and soon the house was nothing but ashes. Elias Marsh was never seen again. The men returned to the town, convinced they had rid themselves of whatever dark force had been haunting them. But that night, the town was shaken by another strange event. As the townsfolk lay in their beds, trying to forget the horrible scream, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in from the forest, covering the town in a blanket of white. In the mist, people began to hear strange whispers, faint at first, but growing louder as the night went on. The whispers were unintelligible, but there was something malevolent in them, a promise of vengeance. The next morning, the fog had lifted, but the town felt different. A heavy, oppressive atmosphere hung over Black Hollow, and the people were filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Over the following weeks, strange things began to happen. People reported seeing a tall, shadowy figure at the edge of the forest at dusk, just standing there, watching. Some claimed to have seen it moving through the trees, its movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. Others said they had heard the same low, guttural scream they had heard the night Elias Marsh's house burned down. One by one, people began to disappear. First, it was the men who had set fire to Elias's farmhouse. They vanished without a trace, their homes left undisturbed, their beds empty in the morning. Then, it was others, children, women, and men alike, taken in the night without a sound. The town was gripped by fear once more, but this time, there was no one to blame, no one to accuse. The figure in the woods, which people began to call the Hollowed Man, became the focus of their terror. The legend of the Hollowed Man grew. Those who had seen him up close described him as impossibly tall and thin, his skin ashen and his eyes hollow black voids. His body was covered in soot and ash, as if he had walked out of the fire that had consumed his home. He moved silently, never making a sound, but his presence was always accompanied by a deep, bone-chilling cold. It was said that if you heard the low, guttural whisper of the Hollowed Man, it meant he was near, and if you saw him, it was already too late. As more people disappeared, the town began to empty. Those who could leave did, abandoning their homes and their lives to escape the curse that had befallen Black Hollow. By the end of the year, the town was a ghost town, its once thriving community reduced to nothing. The last family to leave reported seeing the Hollowed Man standing in the middle of the road as they drove away, watching them with those empty black eyes. Black Hollow has been abandoned ever since. Over time, the town has been reclaimed by the forest, the trees growing up through the streets and houses, their roots cracking the old stone and wood. The only thing that remains of Elias Marsh's farmhouse is a blackened patch of ground at the edge of the forest, where nothing will grow. Today, Black Hollow is nothing more than a forgotten place, its name all but erased from maps. But the legend of the Hollowed Man lives on. Those brave or foolish enough to visit the town at night claim that you can still hear the whispers on the wind, faint but unmistakable, warning you to leave before it's too late. Some say that if you stand in the exact spot where Elias Marsh's house once stood, you can see the Hollowed Man emerging from the trees, his hollow eyes fixed on you, his body covered in ash, still seeking vengeance for the wrongs done to him. And for those who don't heed the warnings, who dare to stay when the whispers grow louder and the air turns cold, they say the Hollowed Man comes for them too. One by one they vanish, just as the townsfolk of Black Hollow did all those years ago. No one knows where they go, but some believe their souls are trapped in the forest, forever wandering alongside the Hollowed Man, cursed to share his eternal torment. The Hollowed Man is more than a ghost or a spirit. He is the embodiment of the town's guilt, the dark legacy of their fear and hatred. His legend is a reminder of the dangers of superstition, of what happens when fear turns to violence, and of the price one pays for the sins of the past. Black Hollow may be gone, but the Hollowed Man remains, waiting in the shadows for those who are foolish enough to disturb the silence of his cursed forest. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.